Thank you, Jeff, and good morning, everyone. In fact, it has been my privilege and honor to serve our community as president at CSU Bakersfield over the past 12 years. And it's my pleasure to introduce our next panel, which will be on local economic conditions and trends. And I'm going to ask them to go ahead and join me on the stage here. And I would add, while they're coming up, that over the last year, CSU Bakersfield has received quite a number of national accolades. And one that I will mention relative to this meeting this morning is that we were ranked by Economist as the #5 university in the country in terms of the value of the degree in terms of economics as measured by mid-career earnings of graduates. We thought that was pretty good. Thank you. So this next panel consists of 3 economists from CSUB. And I'll give brief introductions, and of course the full introductions are in your program. First of all, Dr. Mark Evans is professor and chair of the Department of Economics in the School of Business and Public Administration at CSUB. Previously, he served as associate dean of the school and also as interim dean, and he was also interim dean of our extended university division. He received his Ph.D. from the University of New Mexico and joined the CSUB faculty in 1978. The university was only 8 years old when he joined the university. Second, Dr. Nyakundi Michieka, I had to struggle with that a little bit, is assistant professor of economics. He grew up in Kenya, where he earned his undergraduate degree, and he earned his Ph.D. in natural resources and environmental economics from the University of West Virginia. He came to CSUB in September 2014. Third is Dr. Richard Gearhart. He is also assistant professor of economics. He joined the faculty in August of 2014, coming from Clemson University, where he earned his master's degree and Ph.D. in economics. He's also the managing editor of the Kern Economic Journal. I'm going to turn the panel over to Dr. Evans.
Thank you, Morris. Good morning, everyone. Before we get started, I'd like to point out that starting on page 5 of your printed program, we've compiled some, updated some indicators that we hope is useful to you and maybe has some shelf value if you're sitting somewhere a few months from now and wondering what exactly what the population is or the GDP or whatever. So let us know if what indicators would be of most interest to you if it's not these. And next year we'll adapt. Nyakundi, could we start out by, we don't have time to cover everything that's in the printed program, but what's the big picture in terms of how population's been changing in Kern County and how GDP's been changing?
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Evans, and thank you, Dr. Mitchell, for the wonderful introduction. So what I plan to do, just to answer your question, is I'm going to present 2 slides. And the first slide will talk about how Kern County's population has been changing between 1981 and 2005. And then the next slide will have a graph of how GDP has been changing. So if we were to look at population between 1981 and 2015, here we're talking about, right around the age where the millennials were being born. So around that time, you could see the blue line is the population of Kern County, and then we have a red line which shows the population of California. So the one thing that you might notice is during that span of 35 years, Kern County's population actually doubled from about 400,000 to around 874,000, which is where we are today. During that time, California's population did not grow as fast. And one other thing you'll notice from that graph is that between 2000 and 2010, which is the last decade, Kern County's population was growing twice the speed of California. So we were growing much faster, but that speed actually reduced towards, over the last couple of years. And just to put numbers, between 2014 and 2015, Kern County's population grew at 0.65%, and California's population grew at about 0.93%. So we're kind of slowing down and catching up with that. So we're at 874,000 population for Kern County, and this is a number which is very similar. If you were to think of similar-sized populations or counties which have similar sizes as Kern County, you'd find that San Francisco and Ventura were pretty much the same size with San Francisco and Ventura, and New Haven and Hartford in Connecticut. In terms of countries, if Kern County was to be a country, you'd think of it as Fiji, Comoros, or Guyana. California has a population of 38.7 million, which is a similar size population as Kenya. So that's where we are in terms of population. What about GDP growth? So on the x-axis, we have time. On the y-axis, we have GDP in billions, and we'll do the same thing. We'll look at how Kern County's population is growing in terms of GDP, and we'll do the same with California and see how that's happening. So the one thing you'll notice is that Kern County's GDP has been growing at a much faster rate than that of California. You can notice that before. So the blue line, again, is for Kern County. And there's a dip which we see, which happened during the time of the recession, which pretty much says that Kern County took a much harder hit than California during the recession period. But then we again increased growth, and we were growing faster than California. And this happened up until the last few years. So just to put numbers again into perspective, you have GDP growth over the last 5 years. Bakersfield has been growing much faster than California, and USA, we've been growing at 5% on average over those 5 years, over the last 5 years. But the growth has actually slowed down over the last 1 year.
Great. Yeah. Excuse me. Nyakundi, you've been exploring the relationship between oil prices and employment in the county during periods when there were rapid price increases and rapid price decreases. What's it look like?
Okay, thanks. So if you want to, so what we've done is, I'll just give you a graph here. And so we've talked about GDP, and you can look at GDP, you can look at the whole of Kern County, or you can look at different sectors. You can look at the mining sector, you can look at the construction sector, or farm sector. And what we did is, if you were to look at a particular period where oil prices were going up for about a year, and then stop at that point and look at the next 12 months after that period and see how growth is taking place in these sectors, you'll find that the mining sector and the construction sector are quite sensitive in terms of GDP, are quite sensitive to changes in oil prices. So, when we had prolonged oil price increases, the period that followed that, we found that mining and the construction industry were quite sensitive, but the ag, forestry, fishing and hunting sector and the manufacturing sector were not as sensitive to oil price changes as the mining and the construction. So then there was a study that was put out there, and what these folks did is they said, if oil prices were to decrease by 50%, what do you think we would see in terms of employment at the state level in the United States? So let's look at all the states in the US and say, if oil prices were to decrease by 50%, where do we see a big change in employment? So that shows the map of the US, and the red signifies states where we'd see a large impact in terms of employment. And you'll see that Wyoming gets hit with a 4.3% reduction in employment. You also have North Dakota, which has a 2% decrease in employment, Oklahoma, and then you have the Texas, the West Virginias, and the Louisianas. So this is what's happening at the state level. And what we said is, why don't we look at what's happening at the county level? Because that's where Kern County plays a role. Now, if I was to ask you, ladies and gentlemen, a question, how many people do you think are employed in Kern County's oil and mining sector? Just average. Anyone can answer this question. Pardon? 15,000, 15,000? 15, 8, right? We're around there. So what we did is, what I'll do now is I'll show you a slide, or I'll show you a pie chart which shows the percentage of employees by sector, okay? So in June 2014, you'll find that the oil and gas extraction and the well drilling sector employed 3.55% of the total employees in Kern County. So we're looking at about 12,000 individuals, which is about 2,000 people more than the ones we have at CSU Bakersfield. If you were to look at the other sector, construction employed about 5% of the total employees in Kern County. The manufacturing sector had about 4%. And then the service sector, which is the yellow one, employed about 60% of the employees. We're talking about 209,000 people here. The service sector employs a lot of people. And then the blue is the other industries, which are the farming. So we said, okay, let's look at a snapshot of what's happening in June 2014, and let's look at a snapshot of what's happening in January 2016, about 18 months after the oil prices have actually gone down. Let's see, do we see more people working in the oil industry or farm? What's happening? Okay, let's do the same thing. So we find that, again, the oil and gas and extraction drilling employees reduced. We also saw a reduction in the number of employees in the construction industry, a reduction in the number of employees working in manufacturing, but then the service sector increased, okay? We see an increase in, about 3% from June 2014 to January 2016. So during this period, we're actually seeing more people working in the service industry compared to what we saw a couple of years ago. So while we see some gains, or while we see some losses taking place in one part, we see some gains happening in another sector. With service sector, what we're talking about is we're talking about retail, we're talking about restaurants, we're talking about transportation. When oil prices go down, consumers are left with more disposable income to spend on shopping. We buy food, we go for restaurants, we now upgrade. We go to, we stop going to Applebee's and maybe go to better restaurants, right? And buy better clothes, maybe, if these are normal goods. So those sectors, we've seen an increase in the number. And then the other sectors, which includes farming, has also reduced. So we've seen a growth in the service providing industry. Now, if you were to look at employment in June 2014 and January 2016, and you're to compare, you'll find that in June 2014, we had Kern County employed about 351,000 people, but this number increased to 353,100. So the number of people employed has actually increased during this period, right? So that's a plus to think about. So then we said, okay, well, let's do something else. Let's look at how employment is changing, right? Over the last 25 years, which is pretty awesome, right? 25 years, and let's say, well, on average, what usually happens? Let's look at periods where we had oil price increases and oil price decreases, and then let's look at the 12 months following that period and see what's actually happening to employment. Do we see employment growth? Do we see employment declining? And let's do that with each sector. Let's look at the top 5 sectors. So you have a blue line here that is going to take its time to go from one side to the other, which shows the number of employees in construction, and then you have, those are the farming employees. I have another graph here showing, you can see that that's manufacturing slowly making its way. And after we do that, and then the black line shows the West Texas Intermediate spot prices. So we said, let's look at what's happening every 12 months, during the last 25 years and see what's happening. So in general, over the last 25 years, these are just looking at averages. We're not doing any models here. On average, the oil and gas employment sector, it's very responsive to changes in oil prices. Okay. Construction, again, is responsive to changes in oil prices. Manufacturing sector, it continues to grow despite changes in oil prices. So it's a bit immune, but the one that is quite immune is the service sector, which is not very responsive. So if you're to look at the 12 months following a period of increased oil prices going up or prices going down, you'll find that those 12 months for the service sector, not very responsive. It kind of does its own thing. So we then decided that we're going to let's look at numbers. Let's look at numbers in June 2014 and in January 2016, and let's see what changes we see. The number of employees in oil and gas extraction and well drilling declined by 20%. That's quite a number, but here we're talking about a change from 9,000 people, from 12,000 people to 9,000. So those are, we're talking about 3,000 individuals here. Construction has also gone down. Manufacturing has gone down. Service, talking about 220,000 individuals here. This number has actually gone up. and total employment over that period has actually increased. So we're seeing gains again and losses. We're seeing things happening on both sides. So then we ran a paper. There's a study that Dr. Gearhart and I worked on, and we published it. And what we said is, let's look at how oil prices, oil prices have their own path, and you have employment having its own path. Let's see how these paths move, whether changes in oil prices affect employment, and whether these changes take place in the long run or in the short run. So we found that West Texas Intermediate and the oil and gas and farm sectors, they move together, right, in the long run, but not in the short run. Meaning changes that take place in oil prices in the short run don't really affect farming employment, over the short run. It takes a while before you start to see those effects coming into play. As for manufacturing, construction, and service sectors, West Texas Intermediate does not really influence employment. So that was the study. And then just to cap this, we looked at renewables, and studies have been put out there, and they say that actually the spot price of natural gas has reduced. They moved together with oil prices, but it's actually at its lowest period right now, which is really low. So oil prices of natural gas have also decreased, and this is due to the increase in production or increase in supply of natural gas, primarily coming from Marcellus Shale. What about renewables? Many of us would think, well, if oil prices went down, would we see an increase in renewable energy? Would we see people, adopting more renewable energy technologies because oil prices are low? Well, we did the same thing, and we looked at this. Now, this graph is not as clear, but you may be able to see it in the printed material. But natural gas, total renewable energy, has actually decreased during this period, but investment in renewables has been quite high, as reports have found. So we're seeing changes here and there, but at the end, this is what we're getting to. So what do we take away? Now, since the turn of the decade, Kern County's population has slowed down. It was growing quite fast, but it has slowed down to roughly the same rate as California. That's population. In terms of GDP, we were moving quite fast. We were growing, but it has also slowed down to Kern County's level, to California's level. And then while some sectors lost jobs when the oil prices declined, there was a modest increase in employment in Kern County. And then oil prices affect employment, but the effect is not immediate. So those are some of the takeaways. I hope you at least take one of these home, maybe 2 or 3, or all of them. It'll be really nice if you took all of them. Okay. So I'd like to introduce Dr. Gearhart, who is a health economist at California State, at CSUB. And Dr. Gearhart, the Affordable Care Act is a game changer, and it's gobbling more and more GDP. So what changes are we noticing in Kern County's health industry, and is healthcare more affordable? Do you have more people being covered, and how is that affecting jobs?
So to save a little bit of time, I'm going to skip the first slide. It's not as important. If we look at the percent of children who are uninsured, we've decreased from about 1 in 11 children not being uninsured to much less. So children are a low-cost population that we can treat effectively. It's good to get children insured. If we look at the total number of Medi-Cal beneficiaries since 2009, there's been about 150,000 number increase in total Medi-Cal beneficiaries. So that's a huge increase. And unfortunately, what we're seeing is these individuals are either not utilizing care just because of the long wait times to see their family doctors, or in the second column, they're using the emergency department as their primary source of care. So among Medi-Cal patients, there's been a nearly 10% increase in the number of visits by Medi-Cal patients. That's not good. Unfortunately, even though the number of providers, both in hospitals and nurses, has increased in Kern County, since 2009, there's been a nearly 50% increase in the number of nurses, which is more than total employment, so that's really good. It still isn't keeping pace with the total number of Medi-Cal beneficiaries. And so I want to talk a little bit about healthcare efficiency. And we often hear that Kern County is one of the poorest providers of healthcare. And what we hear is that the healthcare inputs, the providers, the doctors, the nurses, the hospitals, the equipment that we utilize, those are the only things that are used to impact individual health. And that's incorrect. There are a lot of other factors that influence population health. They're demographic. their race, gender, your age, their environmental, your access to clean water, your access to healthy foods, the air quality. Behavioral is huge. Smoking, drinking, those Monster energy drinks that fall out of trucks whenever someone steps in. Economic, unemployment, household income. And so the Robert Woods Johnson Foundation creates county health rankings, and they say that Kern County is near dead last in producing health care. And we've done a study and said, is Kern County health care that bad? And the answer is no. Look at all these factors. Behavioral, we're more likely to smoke, less likely to go to college, less likely to exercise, more likely to have children in poverty, have unclean water, and we have fewer medical providers than California as a whole. Well, if we take a look at the difference in these inputs and some certain health outcomes between us and California, notice the red. We have significantly worse health inputs than health outputs, or our medical providers are fighting an uphill battle from the moment that they see a patient. Basically, healthcare inputs are all significantly much worse in Kern County than in California on average. Healthcare providers are doing a fantastic job providing care that offsets many of these disadvantages that they face. Again, they're fighting an uphill battle. Dr. Michieka and I did a study on this, and we found that Kern County ranks middle of the pack, much better than what previous analyses have found. And we still ask ourselves, is that still low? And the answer is no. Most of the impact of having low health outcomes is behavioral in Kern County. It's the smoking, not exercising, the drinking, eating the fast food. So even though medical providers might be able to provide treatment, health behaviors can offset a lot of the good that our health care can do. Talk very, very briefly on how would a hypothetical minimum wage increase of $15 impact Kern County.
And I noticed in the paper this morning that will be on the ballot in November.
So, very hypothetical. So, we look in the first column, about 40% of the workforce in Kern County earns less than $15 an hour. Pretty much all cashiers, retail salesmen, fast food and restaurant cooks, servers, and farm workers would be impacted. Or essentially, we estimate that 120,000 people in Kern County of the nearly 300,000 would have to have their wages raised. This doesn't take into account the fact that other workers will have their wages raised just because they feel like they need to. And it's mostly driven by the farm sector. One point to make, and it's very important, is that a federal minimum wage is probably not the best tool to combat poverty. A $15 per hour minimum wage feels like $15.35 in Bakersfield and $12.47 in San Francisco. Our dollar goes a lot further than a lot of other places, signifying that perhaps we should look at county-level initiatives if we want to impact poverty. I'll now turn it over to Dr. Mark Evans.
Okay, the United States needs approximately $1.7 trillion of infrastructure by the end of the decade. Now, in a country like Germany or Canada, which is just as committed to environmental quality as the United States, it would take about 2 years to get one of these projects off the ground. Here in the United States, it takes 8 to 10 years to get really the permitting approvals. It's not that Germany is less committed to the environment, it's just that they know how to make a decision. Now, a nonpartisan reform group called Common Good published a study in September that tried to estimate that the cost, in addition to this 1.7 just current capital costs, what are the costs of delaying these projects or this portfolio of projects from, let's say, a 2-year approval rate to an 8. And they found that it would cost actually $3.6 trillion extra in foregone benefits and increased project costs just because of stringing out this process. That's in addition to the 1.7 trillion, just because of the delays themselves. I'm going to skip this chart in the interest of moving on. But there have been several efforts to reform the process, and most of the suggestions focus around four things. One is we need to consolidate authority and make somebody politically accountable. What that means is the decisions have to be made in terms of scope of environmental review, permitting, take them out of the judiciary sector and put it somewhere where someone's politically accountable. Secondly, the role of public comment needs to be transformed from blocking and delaying to informing whoever has the political accountability. Third, we need to remove the fact that an EIR may be imperfect as a grounds for litigation, because things can always be made a little bit better if you're just willing to spend enough money. And then finally, we need specific timelines. Now, please skip this slide too, Richard. The slide I just skipped tried to indicate that really Kern County laid the foundation for attacking a lot of these things that need to be reformed nationwide, starting with wind energy in 1986. But let's fast forward to the present, where we recently changed our process for oil permitting. And basically what's happened here is the county really is now involved for the first time in terms of oil permitting. And what they've done is they've structured this permitting in a way that it's completely what's called ministerial, which means that it involves simply a checkoff regarding whether certain standards have been met. And the standards that have to be met are in the EIR that the county put together, and that EIR is structured to where its standards are substantive enough to constitute an adequate environmental document under CEQA. So that has big implications, because if it stands, there's sort of a once and for all look at whether the EIR is appropriate, and then if it is, it applies to oil development throughout the county. Now, from the perspective of these reform goals I mentioned, in terms of timelines, what we've done is we've incentivized negotiating agreements between surface rights holders and mineral rights holders. This should lead to less litigation, and we've also incentivized it by accelerating permit review timelines if you can come up with a negotiated agreement. In terms of reforming the EIR process, you really can't do anything about that at the local level, but it's kind of creative, and that what our county's trying to do is structure that so there will be one EIR challenge rather than an EIR challenge. It's kind of like a meta challenge that we've got to get through. But if that succeeds, then really the procedure is in place to basically you've done the review for everything that's going to happen after that, rather than having to have a challenge each one individually. And then in terms of rationalizing the authority lines, again, we can't do anything about federal law at the national level, but we have put together a process that's streamlined, coordinated, that's really a roadmap that all other state agencies can do in terms of performing their responsibility in the permitting process. So quite entrepreneurial, in my opinion. Now, the reason I'm talking about physical infrastructure and private investment, as well as education, is those really are the two ingredients of future growth. So, I think in terms of capital formation, as long as we have the stewardship that's required to fund these projects, the county is in a really good position in terms of making sure they happen. With regard to human capital, as President Mitchell mentioned, we now are able to actually figure out what individual colleges are doing in terms of either adding value in the workplace of their graduates or not adding value. There have been two very good studies by very reputable organizations recently, and I'd like to summarize them. First, the Brookings Institution did an evaluation of 2-year colleges and 4-year colleges, and what they came up with in terms of estimate for Bakersfield College is that Bakersfield College really mid-career adds $4,000 more in earnings to its graduates than similar graduates graduating from similar colleges in similar regions. This puts BC in the 85th percentile in terms of 2-year colleges, so this is really a phenomenal result. Taft College. 10 years out, a graduate of Taft College is making almost $7,000 a year more than a graduate with the same personal characteristics graduating from a similar college in a similar region. This puts Taft in the 96th percentile in terms of 2-year colleges. CSUB. The earnings of our typical grad 10 years down the road are almost $12,000 more than graduates of similar colleges that have similar abilities to our students graduating in regions with similar labor markets. That was the 95th percentile in terms of 4-year colleges. Second big study was by the Economist magazine, and the Economist looked only at 4-year colleges, and what it found is this is reassuring, but their estimates were quite close to the Brookings institutions, which suggests that the studies are reliable and that they're coming up with similar estimates. But again, about $11,000 additional earnings over students with the same ability graduating from universities with the same general characteristics. This put us at number 10 in the nation in terms of increase and value added, 99th percentile. Dr. Mitchell told me he's looking forward to another top 10 rating here, 1 or 2 marches down the road. At any rate, final reflection, I think our county is really well positioned. I think what we've done is, in terms of the things we locally can control, we're ready to move forward when oil prices stabilize. Our permitting policies really allow both companies and government to create a decent rate of return by allowing them to implement projects on a timely basis. We saw on the earlier slide that this can make a huge difference in terms of cost and rate of return. Yet the way we've structured this permitting process, we buy the timeliness by really requiring the state-of-the-art environmental protection. So I don't think most people realize that from reading the people that show up at a lot of the public hearings. And then in terms of our universities, they now are really recognized by some very reputable national and international organizations as among the best in the world, or best in the country, I should say. And that's it. Thank you.
Mark and panelists, thank you very much. We appreciate your presentation today.